In the previous sections, we've talked about the correspondence between the various major anatomical structures and the theoretically predicted subsystems of a complex learning system. And now we're going to come to the last one of those structures, the cerebellum. We came up with all these detailed characteristics we expect to see in any sufficiently complex learning system. And as I've talked about before, these are essentially predictions on theoretical grounds, on the basis that the practical requirements will drive certain architectural forms. Now, as I say, we're going to cover the cerebellum next, and it's a bit different from the other structures. In the expected characteristics, the list, the ones we haven't covered address the subsystem that controls the execution of sequences of actions that are often carried out in the same order. And we've provisionally identified the cerebellum as that subsystem. For sequences of behaviors like that, some processing can be avoided and response speed gained because the full information processing apparatus that's required for new learning isn't needed. So, such sequences could be recorded in a separate subsystem and called upon in the appropriate circumstances. But once called upon, the sequence will tend to continue rapidly through to its completion. The identification of the cerebellum as this action sequence manager in the brain begins with the observation that it operates in parallel with the basal ganglia thalamus route. And the other key observation is that damage to the cerebellum results in the kind of deficits we'd expect to see with damage to a sequence manager. And as we described, the ability to control sequences of motions, like moving your finger from a distant point to touch your nose, can be affected by cerebellar damage, but the ability to initiate and perform individual movements is unaffected. It's just how the movements are connected together in sequences that's degraded. It's slower and more erratic. Also, what you'd expect to see is the sequence manager getting inputs from the places in the brain that provide detailed information on which behaviors are currently appropriate. And you'd expect to see it sending outputs directly to the points where behaviors are actually driven. Now, the regular motor control path takes outputs from the motor cortex, processes them through the basal ganglia and thalamus, then the thalamus releases cortex outputs to the brainstem and spinal cord to drive the muscles that control the movements. So the behavioral drivers come from the cortex, and the place where behaviors are implemented is the brainstem and spinal cord. The cerebellum gets inputs from the same cortical sources via the pontine nuclei, and it directly targets the brainstem and the spinal cord. Non-motor behaviors are implemented by release of receptive field detections between different cortical areas by the thalamus, and for this purpose, the cerebellum directly targets the thalamus. Rapid implementation of each action in a sequence requires receptive fields that are very, very specific to the exact combinations of different circumstances in which one action should be initiated. The sequence has already been learned, so because this part of the brain doesn't need to learn the behaviors, a receptive field detection can essentially be interpreted as a command to perform the next action in the sequence. In other words, a very specific receptive field is required that's essentially an unambiguous instruction. Purkinje cells are very large neurons that are unique to the cerebellar cortex. One Purkinje has inputs from between 100 and 200,000 granule cells, and of course there's about 50 billion granule cells, 10 times the number of pyramidal neurons in the whole cerebral cortex. One granule cell in the cerebellar cortex only has about 4 inputs from the pons, but one pontine neuron has thousands of inputs from the cortex. And the axon bundle connecting the cortex to the pontine nuclei carries about 20 million axons, about 20 times larger than the optic nerve connecting the eyes to the brain. So the implication is that Purkinje receptive fields are targeted at extremely specific circumstances, corresponding with the firing of just the right combinations of huge numbers of cortical neurons. The other consideration is that the major contribution of the sequence manager is to the timing of actions. It won't be capable of complex learning. It can't change the nature of any one behavior or the order of behaviors, but it can adjust the length of time between behaviors. And as in the simple example we talked about when discussing the cerebellum, we're programmed with an instinctive behavior. If our eyes feel a puff of air, we blink soon afterwards. And that's pretty much found in any animal with eyes. And lots of animals, including humans, can learn to adjust the timing of the blink. If over a number of occasions an audible tone starts up, always the same length of time before the puff of air, so it provides a standard warning if you like, the brain can learn to initiate the eye blink earlier, at a fixed time period after the tone starts, to coincide with the puff. Now, provided the tone always goes on until after the puff occurs, the cerebellum is the structure that supports the learning, shifting the timing of the blink. But on the other hand, if the tone and the puff don't overlap in time, the cerebellum can't do it alone. The hippocampus is also needed. So when the only learning is relative timing, the cerebellum can handle it, but it's not able to handle learning complex associations. The structure that inputs timing information is the inferior olive, which gets information from the spinal cord, and rather unusually gets information almost directly from the retina without going through the thalamus and cortex. And very few parts of the brain get information from the eyes apart from that route through the thalamus. So the implication is that the information has to get to the inferior olive as fast as possible. So the inferior olive is getting information about the visual environment and the position of your body by very fast routes, so it can determine if actions are happening at just the right time. So again, the characteristics that are predicted for this sequence manager in a complex learning system appear to match the characteristics of the cerebellum in the brain.